Record it. It just takes a bit of time to crank up.
I think we're live now.
Yeah. Okay, record to the cloud. Good morning. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are. I'm sitting in London. Akthar Bhai is sitting in Washington DC, and I think we have a lot of viewers in Bangladesh. So it's a fairly global program. So thank you everybody for joining. Today, this is the third Pathfinder macro discussion. The first one was on the Fed, the second one was on income inequalities and COVID, and this one is on Bangladesh economic policy. So definitely very diverse. So I wanted to welcome Syed Akthar Mahmood, who's a friend, and we've worked together on different projects. He's retired now, but he was the principal private sector development specialist at the IFC and World Bank group. Has very extensive knowledge and experience across multiple countries, and spent a good amount of time in Bangladesh. And since he's retired, has been quite a prolific writer on a number of important policy issues, particularly with respect to FDI, export diversification. So I think that the purpose of today's discussion is for us to take a step back and think about the economic challenges, but also the opportunities in the policy strategy that Bangladesh should be following in the aftermath of the COVID crisis. There's been a lot of focus, especially domestically in Bangladesh, on the headline growth numbers. That Bangladesh has outperformed most other countries in Asia, probably with the exception of China. And also per capita income in Bangladesh has overtaken India. And all these things are very good. It's great country branding, and I can understand why it's also politically very important. But it's probably not the most, let's say, the most important thing for the future direction of the economy, which is how is Bangladesh going to catch up with some of the other Asian tigers or the neo tigers. And in today's program, we'll talk specifically about Vietnam. So in terms of the format today, Akthar is going to go through a few slides, and in particular, he's going to be addressing, what drives FDI, the characteristics of FDI, foreign direct investment into Bangladesh. Is it the right kind of FDI, and what is the role of FDI in economic growth? The second important topic will be export diversification. And related to that, we will also discuss why Vietnam has been such a standout story, economic growth story, particularly in the area of technology and technology manufacturing. Why is Bangladesh lagged, and how can Bangladesh catch up? So we again have a very ambitious target from the ICT ministry, $5 billion of ICT exports, or in 5 years, from less than $1 billion now. So beyond software exports, Bangladesh also has aspirations to be a technology manufacturing powerhouse. Is that realistic or not? So these are some of the questions we'll discuss today. And now let me hand it across to Akthar Bhai to kick off the discussion. Akthar, across to you.
Well, thank you, Ifty, and thank you very much for having me on this program. And this is a subject that I have worked on, you have worked on a lot. In fact, in Bangladesh, you have probably worked on this subject at a much more practical level than I have. But I'm looking forward to this conversation. As you said, I have a few slides. Let me share the screen now. I'll go through the slides rather quickly, and then hopefully we'll have a stimulating conversation here. So let me put this on. Okay. So, and let me also minimize the screen so I can also see the charts. So as we all know, our export basket is heavily dependent on one product, and that's garments. And you can look at the chart here. The darker blue bars are the total exports, and the lighter blue bars are the apparel or garment exports. Data from 96 onwards, and you can see that throughout this period, garment exports have dominated the export basket, and the proportion actually has been rising over time. So for example, in about 10 years ago, it was 78%. And then currently it's about 83, 84%. So that's a heavy concentration on one product. But even within garment exports, there's a concentration within garments as well in 5 product groups. So t-shirts, trousers, sweaters, jackets, and shirts account for just over 70% of all garment exports. Now, this proportion was even higher a few years ago. So it means that there is some diversification happening within garments. There are some products beyond these 5 product groups that are emerging as important export products. I'm told by insiders in the industry that even within these 5 product groups, which are fairly broad categories, there is some diversification as well. So, but nonetheless, the big picture is very clear. We are still heavily dependent on garment exports, and garment exports in turn are heavily dependent on 5 products. Now, what should be our aspiration moving forward from this heavy dependence on one product, which also happens to be a relatively simple product? Now, I don't want to say that garment production is necessarily a very simple activity. It is certainly very challenging in many ways, but the product itself is simple. And there is a lot of talk about moving from simple to complex products. And I have got a chart here. I don't know if it's very clearly visible, but each of these lines show the progression of a country over the period from mid-90s to now on what is called the Product Complexity Index. This is something prepared by the Growth Lab at Harvard. They have done very detailed work, and they have very detailed data on their website on what they call product complexity. So they take different products and they have a certain way of measuring the complexity, and then they combine all that to form this overall complexity index. And if you look at this chart, you will see that in the mid-90s, Bangladesh's complexity, of course, was much less than, let's say, USA, China, or India, but it was actually more than that of Vietnam. And yet now, Vietnam has surpassed us. It's way up there, just after India. Significant jump in the complexity index of Vietnam, whereas Bangladesh's has actually gone down. And it has gone down for the reasons I just showed in the earlier chart, that garments, which is a relatively simple product, has become more and more important in our export basket. But what really strikes us here is the very significant increase in complexity, the average complexity of Vietnamese exports. So now, as we approach middle income status, we must think about changing our manufacturing product mix as well as our export basket mix by introducing more complex products. But the question is why? Why am I talking about a shift from simple to complex products? So what is the argument for that? It's very simple. Complex products, for example, electronics, involve a much wider range of knowledge and skills than simple products like garments, which means that countries which are producing a critical mass of complex products are actually acquiring a certain set of skills and knowledge broader than what is required when you produce a simpler product. And once you acquire those skills and knowledge, it actually makes it possible for them to branch out into other complex products or even other simple products. So given that knowledge and skills are so important to have a diversified manufacturing and export base, investing some effort in producing some complex products helps you acquire those skills and knowledge, and therefore increases the possibilities for you, increasing the possibilities, the set of possibilities. But there's another reason also. Complex products usually fetch a higher price, which allows you to pay higher wages to the higher skilled workers needed to produce that product. So it is time now, I think, for Bangladesh to compete based on skills and not on cheap labor. We have to move away from this notion of competitive advantage based on low-cost labor to competitive advantage based on skills. So that was the argument for moving away from simple products to complex products, which also would mean that our exports would become diversified over time. Now, let's take one example. Let's take the example of electronics, and let's compare Bangladesh with Vietnam. Now, in 1995, Vietnam and Bangladesh were at the same situation as far as electronics exports were concerned. The total volume was the same, about $30 million. And as proportion of exports, it was less than 1%. In fact, Bangladesh was marginally better than Vietnam, 0.75% versus 0.64%. Nothing very different, but nonetheless, we were a little ahead of Vietnam in 95. After that, as you can see, the blue line there is Vietnam and the orange is Bangladesh. So we have more or less remained stagnant. Our export of electronics has remained the same in terms of the absolute value, in terms of proportion of exports. In fact, it has gone down and it's certainly still below 1%. Whereas for Vietnam, it's now almost 40%. It's almost 40% of their exports comes from electronics. In 2018, Vietnam was exporting $102 billion worth of electronics. So it's a huge difference there between Bangladesh and Vietnam. Although 30 years ago, or 35 years ago, we were exactly at the same place. So how did Vietnam do this miracle? What is it that they did which we didn't? Well, there are a number of factors here. I'm going to focus a bit on FDI, but let me mention the other factors. One, of course, is skills. Especially after Vietnam opened up, they emphasized not just access to education, but high quality education. So it enabled the younger generation in Vietnam to acquire at least the basic cognitive skills and other skills which are needed for them to go and do well in sophisticated industry like electronics. Of course, there was a lot of learning once they joined the industry, but you need to have the basic training through your primary and secondary education systems to be able to learn the skills required in these sophisticated industry. Secondly, they had much more open trading arrangements than we have. They have free trade agreements with several countries. They're part of several regional preferential trade agreements. ASEAN is one example, but there are more, especially with the European Union. Bangladesh is way behind in this respect. We recently signed a free trade agreement with Bhutan. That's good, but Bhutan's market is not that great, and Bhutan is not a major source of imports for us. The advantage of free trade agreements is not just that you have a much wider market at your disposal, but also the imports are easy. And industries like electronics use lots and lots of components, all of which cannot be produced in the country itself. So the ease with which you can import these components, which depends on the import regime, it depends on the customs administration, all of that, Vietnam is doing much better than us. But the fourth, actually there's a third one, which is land. And this I want to also emphasize, because in Bangladesh, historically, the problem in attracting foreign investors, one of the problems was the inability to give them land. And we had an unfortunate case. Samsung wanted to come and invest big time in Bangladesh, I think about 10, 15 years ago. And that did not happen. One of the reasons being we could not give them the land that they wanted. And apparently they wanted land in the Korean EPZ. And as you know, if the Bangladesh for some reason took a long, long time to approve the operational license for the Korean EPZ. Now it is operational, but for a long, long time, it had been built, but was not able to give plots to investors. And we lost a lot of investors, particularly one like Samsung, because of that. Now the scenario is changing. Ifty, as you know, the Economic Zones program is one of the most ambitious and also vibrant programs of the government. A lot of economic zones are being prepared. Some of these would be specific to countries. So hopefully that land constraint is going to be eased significantly. But that was something that Vietnam had sorted out much earlier than we did. But the big thing in Vietnam was FDI. Now, here is a chart. And here the orange, I think I've slipped the colors this time. Orange represents Vietnam and blue represents Bangladesh. And once again, you see these are 3-year moving averages. Bangladesh still less than 2% of GDP, and in Vietnam it has fluctuated between 4 and 10% of GDP in the last 35 years. The data is from 86 onwards. So a very substantial difference in the volume of FDI flows into Vietnam, even though 35 years ago in the mid-80s, we were exactly at the same place. So you see the parallel, same story with electronics. We were at the same position and then the trajectories differed significantly. You see the same thing with foreign direct investment. Now in Vietnam, the foreign invested companies now contribute up to 70% of total exports. And if you take electronics, that proportion is even higher. And this electronics breakthrough that Vietnam made started with an investment that Samsung made. It was just under $700 million in 2008 in one of the northern provinces of Vietnam. They made this big investment. Now their investment is almost $20 billion. So Samsung had a very good experience with their very first investment, and then they have expanded. Others have come in. Intel has come in, others are coming in. And that's another important lesson for us. When we have investors coming into our country, we have to make sure that they have good experience. Because if they have a good experience, A, they are going to reinvest, and B, others are going to follow their lead, and they will also come and invest. That's exactly what has happened in Vietnam. But we are far, far behind, as you can see, on the evolution of FDI. The next question is, okay, what type of FDI have we received? We know it's not a big deal, but what have we received so far? This is the stock of FDI at the end of the last fiscal year. So this is end of June 2020. And you will see the single largest sector is gas and petroleum. We do have textile and apparels after that, and then we have several other sectors. But the big picture is the following. In the early years, much foreign investor interest in Bangladesh was confined to exploiting natural resources. So gas and petroleum, and I think this is primarily gas, was actually even more important in the early years. Later, as our economy started expanding, FDI inflows were dominated by what we call market-seeking investment. So these are targeting the domestic market. And these were investment in infrastructure like power generation and telecoms. Now, the third category after natural resource seeking and market seeking FDI is what we call efficiency seeking FDI, where the investors see some cost efficient opportunities of producing in, let's say, Bangladesh and exporting abroad. So using Bangladesh as the production base for exports. Now in Bangladesh, some FDI has gone into export-oriented industries. As I said, textile and apparels, the stock of FDI is the second largest, but this is textile and garments. These are traditional export products, the so-called simpler products, not the more complex products like electronics. There hasn't been much or probably no investment at all in these kind of industries. So the strategy going forward is to attract more efficiency-seeking FDI, especially in the production of complex products, because they can help us make that jump from simple to complex products, which we can export abroad and get a foothold in the domestic market. So that establishes the importance of FDI. Now, just a little bit on electronics. Now, we do have an electronics industry in Bangladesh, and I saw that in the last budget, there's mention of supporting what is being called the Made in Bangladesh strategy and a set of fiscal support measures, which includes tax exemption as well as import tariff protection, in order to encourage the domestic manufacturing of products like electronics and I think also light engineering and some other products. Now, the question that we must keep in our mind is the Made in Bangladesh slogan is appealing, but we need to proceed with caution. Because what we don't want to end up with is creating more profits artificially by protecting industry without any efficiency gains. Now, the rationale behind protecting certain industry is that you give them some space in which they can compete against imports and use that breathing space to build the competencies, the capabilities which are required to then go and move into the export market. But this is not going to happen by itself. And let's look at this chart here. On one axis, I'm talking about proportion of components that are manufactured domestically. So if the proportion of components that is manufactured domestically increases, because right now in electronics, most of the components are imported from abroad and they're just assembled in the country. But if more and more components are manufactured domestically, we can say that that's a certain indicator of progression in that industry. The other would be the proportion of output that's exported. So that's what I'm showing on the x-axis here. Both of these can be indicators of sort of progression of the domestic electronics industry. Right now, we are probably somewhere at point A. There may be some factories which are a little higher in terms of the proportion of components they are manufacturing domestically. Some are probably still at very low levels, and not much of our electronics are being exported. So we are at point A. Now, there are three directions in which we can move. One could be that over time, gradually, we increase the proportion of components which are manufactured domestically. So we are moving from A to B. The other could be that we still continue to import most of the components. We assemble them here, but the products are of such a good quality that we can start exporting them. So we start moving from A to C. The other would be doing both. So more and more components are produced in Bangladesh, and more of the output is being exported. That's a movement from A towards D. I would submit that that is what we should be aspiring to, a movement from A towards D. And if we are going to give support to the industry, that support should be in exchange for taking those actions which would allow that movement from A to D. So it's very important that the government would come up with some ways in which it can measure whether that movement is happening. It can take the help of economists, industry specialists, other analysts, come up with a set of indicators, and then make sure that they get the data from the industry to be able to assess whether the industry is making that progression. I just want to use this example to just make a bigger point. The government does give support of various kinds to industry from time to time. I don't think they demand performance in return as strongly as they should, as strongly as the East Asians had done, for example. The East Asians had also provided support to the industry, but it came with very tough performance conditions. These were clearly defined, these were monitored, and if the performance targets were not met, the governments were actually quite ruthless in withdrawing that support. That kind of performance culture needs to come into the government as well as the private sector of Bangladesh. So if those were a few of the themes that you had actually mentioned in your introduction, and I just wanted to elaborate. So let me stop there for now, and let's carry on the conversation.
Okay. Thank you so much. I think Akthar, you shared, I think that made a number of important points. I mean, Vietnam has been the runaway export powerhouse in Asia, and probably the dominant success story after the original Tigers, which was Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Korea. And to some extent, and then there was another wave of Malaysia, Indonesia, and others, but really Vietnam has made probably the fastest running. I was going to add, I think, as you said, I think FDI is critical. The Samsung's tragedy, I call it, about the Samsung factory should have been in Bangladesh, not in the outskirts of Hanoi. So FDI is very, very important, as you said. Human skills is very, very important. And as you said, free trade agreements. So I think on free trade agreements, I mean, my observation would be we need to, I think, be more confident, self-confident as a country. And not be scared of being overwhelmed by imports. If we relax, move into free trade agreements, there's a lot of local protectionism, and I think that's a very similar phenomenon in India. That's also preventing India from entering into Trans-Pacific Partnership and other kinds of RCEP. I mean, TPP is dead, but RCEP, India is having a lot of hesitation there. So I think that the reality is we're actually importing $11 billion of products from China, probably unofficially, officially maybe $3-4 billion, but unofficially $6-7 billion from India. So we're already importing a lot. And I think that we need to, I think that the industry, I think we have to move away from this protectionist mindset. And it's not easy for the government. They get lobbied very aggressively, not only for subsidies, but also so on the one hand for subsidies, on the other hand for protections. And we need to have a critical, so I don't know what your thoughts are on let's say this, we call it national self-confidence, or let's say being bold and brave as in terms of our free trade strategy. So what are your thoughts on that?
Right. And of course, I mean, there should be quite a bit of analytic work which was behind these agreements. So we have to look at the type of imports that may come in. For example, if we sign an FTA with Germany, the kind of imports that would come in would be different than if we had signed one with the USA. So that there's a lot of analytic work to be done there. But yes, in terms of the attitude, there has to be this confident attitude. I think certainly in the private sector, despite all the dynamism that we have seen so far, there is still this tendency to seek protection and support of different kinds without necessarily producing the performance improvements, the changes that should come with this. I think given the track record over the last 30 years or so, the entrepreneurs in Bangladesh can make that jump. The question is, would they have the incentive? Now, for businesses, of course, it's natural for them to ask for different types of support. But if the government is tougher in terms of demanding performance in return, I have a feeling that we have enough entrepreneurial skills and enough confidence in the private sector for them to respond to that challenge. So I think a lot of the burden also falls in government. Right now, they're happy to respond to these requests and then make big pronouncements as, for example, I think the minister has made this time that this is a very business-friendly budget that I put forward. But I would make a distinction between business-friendly and being market-friendly. By market-friendly, I mean competition and competitiveness. So I think the policies of the government and particularly the budget should be a market-friendly budget in the sense that we are going to impose the competitive discipline on our enterprises. And I think the enterprise, once they are exposed to that discipline by government, I think they will rise up. So in a sense, we are under-exploiting the potential of our private sector by making certain things easy for them.
Yeah, no, I mean, I deal, like you have, I deal a lot with, many private sector business, leading private sector businesses. And I think as not just an inside, but outside observer, having been in many countries as you have in my previous career before coming to Bangladesh, I was struck by how I think Bangladeshi entrepreneurs are some of the highest quality in the world. And there's I was reminded of an expression from Friedrich Nietzsche: what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And I think that's kind of the, the mindset of many Bangladeshi business people, which again, as you said, is surprising that they've been, I mean, at least some, I'm not saying all, but some, I think they will compete in the international marketplace much more effectively, as you were suggesting, than maybe they currently give themselves credit for. There was a similar conversation, maybe for a future dialogue we'll have. We're currently working on a project on how to connect the UK and Bangladesh for B2C in garments, and obviously that itself is a very large discussion about what. But the reason I bring that up is that some of the people I'm working with, one very esteemed business school professor and also a major RMG player as well, said to me, Ifty, well, why would they bother? And I mean, why would Bangladeshi RMG companies go from B2B to B2C? Don't we have to convince them? I was like, well, I'm the novice in the RMG sector, but aren't the figures self-explanatory? If you have 8 to 10% of the value addition by just manufacturing and selling to Zara. And if you can establish and you have confidence and you have the strategic plan to start selling directly to consumers, whether it's on Amazon or whether it's through retail, technology has lowered the barriers to selling direct to customers, the costs of being that business. So again, I'm just showing that as an example. There's a lot of nervousness and reluctance to do that.
Yeah. Let me also point out, I mean, that let's say comment is very relevant because we must also acknowledge that the investment climate in Bangladesh is not conducive. So businesses do face a lot of challenges. And one argument given for this support is this is a compensation for the poor investment climate, right? So the government is not improving the investment climate, so they can compensate a bit by providing all this support. Now, that's not a good long-term strategy. The long-term strategy would be, on the one hand, to improve the investment climate, and we can discuss some aspects of it today. But at the same time, whatever support is given with tough performance conditions and which are themselves designed in the context of a longer-term strategy, like the one which I was mentioning, moving from simple products to complex products, and then frame your support policy in the context of that. So this idea that, okay, we are not being able to improve the investment climate, therefore we have to help them out, the businesses, this is not a good long-term strategy.
Yeah, I think something else, I think maybe a topic for your next article, I think an additional area I could suggest is also very important in the Vietnam success story, and probably the gorilla in the room is China, is actually regional supply chains. So how Bangladesh, and I think you touched on it a little bit in terms of free trade, but to be a successful manufacturing powerhouse, you have to integrate into regional and global supply chains. And I think that there's maybe an underappreciation. Just having, when a company is saying manufacturing, a good example is actually Thailand. Thailand became this major exporter from Toyota pickup trucks to Dell computers, hard drives, lots of different things, because they became the hub for the regional integration into the sort of Southeast Asian regional supply chain. And probably the best example is Shenzhen itself. I was involved with Shenzhen Stock Exchange's investment Dhaka Stock Exchange, but I've been Shenzhen many times. Now Shenzhen is now, the per capita income in Shenzhen is the same as Hong Kong. So it's quite a bit higher than the US. But actually, so Shenzhen is not a cheap area, but you'll find that in many areas of electronics manufacturing, Shenzhen is still the most competitive in the world. Why is that the case? Because it's the epicenter of the electronics industry supply chain. You can, if you want to manufacture headphones or mobile phones or anything else, solar, electric, vehicle batteries, you can put that manufacturing process together and you can have a prototype product done in a week that might take, 3 months elsewhere, because all of the suppliers, and there's this kind of ecosystem of very efficient suppliers. So I don't know what your thoughts are on supply chains. That's probably something that, again, is a complex topic. Yeah.
So let's think of the laptop computer that we're using, right? Now this has dozens of parts in it, right? Now, even if you develop the competence to make one or two of those parts, the amount of export earnings that you're going to have, because the entire computer market is so huge, even a small fraction of that probably could rival our garment exports, right, at some point. So all you need is the competence to be able to make maybe 2 or 3 of those components. So we don't have to be like Shenzhen, where most of the components are made. We just need to have that niche and enter one part of that value chain, right? So that's very consistent with what I was saying earlier, that once you start going into these complex products, it doesn't have to be a product 100% being made in Bangladesh. You just find out that niche and go into that.
That seems to be against the, coming back to the import, and I'm just playing devil's advocate. If you think about the import substitution, bias of say, making LCD televisions or air conditioners or mobile phones or everything else. So that sense is that import substitution is kind of against specialization in some sense. There's a risk. You have to have a balance, would you say?
Right. Well, maybe in the early stage, you have that policy with the performance conditions that I mentioned. So there is an incentive to get better and better if not in everything, but at least some of the components. So if your horizons are limited to the domestic market because of the protection, then you don't feel that need, just as our garment manufacturers are not feeling the need to move from B2B to B2C. So there's a satisficing behavior here, not a maximizing behavior. So the same thing would happen with our electronics manufacturers. The incentive to become very competitive in at least some components will not be there. So the import substitution can create that breathing space for a while in which to build your competencies. So the question is whether the competencies are being built. That is something which needs to be monitored.
Yeah.
Sorry,
please go. Okay.
No, you're mentioning Shenzhen, and you're mentioning how different component producers are all next to each other, which is very, very important. And that's where, again, the economic zones program of Bangladesh is actually open up our possibilities. I mean, we had the EPZs, but they were not very large in area. I mean, the largest was about 300 acres or so. Whereas this huge, I think it's in Mirsharai in Chittagong, I think it's called the Bangabandhu Industrial Zone, is about 30,000 acres, 10 times of that, which is being developed, right? Which means that if today you attract a foreign investor like Samsung or someone else to make electronics, and they want some of their component suppliers to be also in Bangladesh, but they would want them to be located near to them so that they can supervise them, and the logistical costs of getting the components, even if they're in Bangladesh, would be much less. But then you need to be able to give not only Samsung a plot of land for their main factory, but also have a area around them where their suppliers can also come and set up their factories, right? So that kind of agglomeration possibilities are now coming up. But then the question is, what kind of investors are coming into the economic zones? Are we just building the zones, or are we being strategic about what kind of investors we are going to bring in? Because what we are offering in the zones, the land, which is unencumbered, there's no problem with the titles or anything, right? There's utility, the infrastructure. It's a great assets we are offering to investors. The question is, what are we going to get in return for that? So I'm not yet sure whether we have a very strategic vision on what kind of investors to attract now that we are solving the land problem.
Yeah, I think that I would tend to agree, at least in my, I don't have the extensive interaction with policymakers and government officials that you had when you were at the IFC, but in my experience, I don't think, unfortunately, so far we don't have any clear strategic plan. Well, maybe no plan is a bit unfair, but I would say, when we talk about the strategy for the economic zones, we actually have to have, I think, a much more developed industrial strategy where we think much more clearly about which sectors and which industries we can actually be competitive in. There is a naive assumption that we can be competitive in everything. That simply isn't true. And a good example is, say, electric vehicles or batteries. I think that I'm already seeing there's a number of electric vehicle companies saying we're going to, launch the Tesla in Bangladesh and have, nationwide network. Well, we don't have a nationwide network of chargers. If we think about battery technology, we don't have any particularly strong competitive advantage there. I mean, I don't want to pick EV is the best example, but we have to also be very cognizant about what we're actually, what we as a country we should be more targeted in which industries we want to develop, and we should have our own national strategy, and that should influence which companies we invite in.
Right. Now, on this subject of inviting companies, right? So you can have a reactive approach when companies are coming, either in response to your road shows or they've done their own research. You come in, and how do you react to that? That's one set of issues, and I'll address that as well. The other is the proactiveness. Now, if you take Costa Rica, for example, many, many years ago, and there is a very good case study done by the Harvard Business School on this, the way they attracted Intel. So they took a strategic decision that they want to go into the kind of products, semiconductors, whatever Intel produces, and then they targeted Intel, and then they dedicated a whole team to go and first pursue Intel, and once Intel was interested, to make sure that whatever they need, their needs are satisfied as long as they're consistent with the strategy of the country. And there was a lot of common ground, so they could proceed, and then Intel made a major investment in Costa Rica. Now, Costa Rica was on on their long list initially, and then because of the efforts of the government, it came to the short list. And then as a result of the negotiations, etc., it was Costa Rica which won the bid, and Intel decided to invest there. So we need to have that proactive approach, but as you said correctly, Ifty, that should derive from a good long-term industrialization strategy. And the kind of things I was saying at the beginning, like moving from simple products to complex products. And by the way, a lot of these complex products are labor intensive. So it's not that our employment goals will not be met. I mean, electronics assembling is a reasonably labor intensive activity. So there's a consistency there, but we need to have that vision, which should be based on a realistic appreciation, assessment of what our capabilities are, while also recognizing that capabilities can develop over time, right? And that's why economists don't talk of just static competitive advantage, they also talk of dynamic competitive advantage. Your competitive advantage can change as you acquire the skills to do so. So some strategic thinking, but also realizing that your strategy may have to evolve as things start evolving. You need to be flexible and dynamic in that approach.
So I think that another I think observation is the I would say in fact I was just thinking about a table that I read a couple of days ago, which actually was showing that there's actually a table about who are the top suppliers for Apple. So for who are the top global suppliers for Apple. And for a long time, Taiwan was the leading global supplier for Apple components. Now China's become, this is the first year China's ever taken Taiwan as the leading global supplier, Chinese companies. Taiwan is number 2, Japan is number 3. And that is kind of, I mean, Apple, I think, is the kind of the benchmark for global best-in-class component supplies. But anyway, coming back to your point, I would say,
on this, let's say, just for a moment on this, I mean, we can do a kind of benchmarking here, okay? Let's say we are the 30th largest producer to Apple. Let's say we have made that breakthrough. And then we can see whether we can gradually improve our rankings. This is the kind of metrics that we should be looking at, performance metrics. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think a second, another couple of observations would be good to get your thoughts on. One is that I think that, what you were just saying, I think there's a kind of complacency. I don't want to criticize. I think BIDA has become a much more dynamic institution, and I think it's heading in the right direction. But I think that there is a complacency I always find in Bangladesh, not just for officials, but also in the private sector, where they assume, look, people want to come to us. Well, that's actually not a given. So I think that if you actually see how competitive the global FDI marketplaces, or the global investment marketplaces, or the global economic marketplaces, and I think what you said is absolutely correct. I think that we need a much more focused, FDI, at a company level. And I remember, there was a former, I think, the sort of equivalent of the BIDA, chairman, or actually, he's actually a minister level person in Singapore. The Minister for Foreign Investment in Singapore was a young guy, ex-JP Morgan managing director, and he used to just get on the phone and start calling up company CEOs and saying, and they would. So I remember reading about it. They would kind of fall off their chair and say, he would just call up and say, "This is such and such. I'm the Minister of Foreign Investment in Singapore," and it's that kind of, let's say, investment banking approach. Look, it's a transaction. I got to close this transaction. That actually is a very different mindset. I think we're seeing a little bit of that. In I think the ICT ministry and a few other ministries that are targeting foreign technology manufacturing, but I think there needs to be much more of this, not a complacency. Of course, Bangladesh is a very successful, it's a great success story, and I think we have a lot of good materials in terms of brand reputation now, in terms of Bangladesh being a success story, but I think we have to have a close the deal mindset in terms of FDI. I don't know what you feel. So.
Oh yeah, good. No, that's a good segue to a number of things I wanted to say about the way we are managing the foreign investor attraction program. I don't know how much time we have, but maybe 3-4 minutes would be enough for me to the main points, and then if we have more time, we can carry on. So a number of things. First, in terms of complacency, one aspect of the complacency is that we have got all the right policies in place. We have very investor-friendly policies, etc., etc. What we fail to appreciate is that there's a big difference between policies on paper and policies as they're actually implemented. And for the investors, that is a big deal. Yes, the policies on paper may be the first thing to attract them, but they will, at the end of the day, look at how policies are being implemented. And they're going to come and talk to the existing investors, the Grameen phones and others who already invested in the country. And if these investors have had a bad experience, the other investors are going to think twice. So my second point is that you also have to take care of the existing investors. And we know of several instances where there have been issues with existing investors, which have dragged on for a long time. And these things are noticed by new investors. We must also point out that a lot of the foreign investment in a country happens through reinvestments by those who are already here. So that's one reason, but more importantly, others are going to take note of how you're dealing, how you're treating your existing investor. And that brings me to another point. Unlike in other countries, we do not have a good, what is called an investor grievance mechanism. Many other countries have established these systems where an investor who's already in the country, having some issues with some part of government, can go and lodge a complaint with the lead investment agency or a lead ministry. So some agency is designated as the lead. And then that agency looks at the problem, identifies the government agencies which are responsible, bring them all together, if necessary, bang their heads together, and they should have the clout to do that, and they resolve these problems. And there are many examples of how investments which could have been lost have actually been saved because of this grievance mechanism. And investors who have not yet come to Bangladesh, they are going to be impressed if they see that there is such a mechanism in place, because they will know that making the first entry is not the end of the game. How things evolve once they are here is going to be very important. So that's important. The other thing I would say is the World Bank recently did a survey of almost 1,000 CEOs of multinational companies which are foreign investors. And the factor which came out at the top of the list of factors which discourage them is regulatory and policy uncertainty. And I think Bangladesh doesn't score well on this. Again, because of all the problems with regard to policy implementation. So it's not so much the uncertainty with the policies as they're written, they may be fairly stable, but when it comes to the decisions on the coal front, there's a lot of uncertainty. And that is what puts off a lot of the investors. So when government officials say that, well, a lot of investors are showing interest, my question would be, then how come our foreign investment figures are still below 2% of GDP? What's happening to all this interest? So there's a big gap between interest and the actual materialization of the investments. And that gap may be quite high in Bangladesh. And I'm not sure if the Bangladesh government even has a tracking system to track investors who had shown some interest. So what has happened to these investors who showed up in the road shows, who then took some interest? How many of them have invested? And if they're stuck somewhere, where are they stuck? So these kind of tracking systems, I don't think exist in Bangladesh. So it brings me back to that core theme of performance culture. If the government really has a performance culture in terms of attracting FDI, it will be tracking all these things.
Yeah, no, I think that I gave the example about Singapore, and it's not the only example about a minister actually, picking up the phones and sort of, trying to close the deal himself. So that's a very different mindset and culture. And I think one of the things that struck me about lots of government roadshows is that there's really very little structured follow-up. So when there's a roadshow, is there an actual database of those who attended? Is there a proactive attempt to contact the people who attended, give them information, see if they're interested? How can they be followed up? Can we connect them with different companies? Even when roadshows where of course, roadshows where there's the prime minister or ministers go and there's a business delegation, that's ideal. But even there, I think it's getting better, but B2B matching and particularly follow-up is much weaker, I think, than other countries. So yeah, I think that's something else we need to improve.
In Bangladesh, I think culturally we are much more interested in events rather than processes. I mean, that's true of many of the things that we do. We are very interested in big events, but follow-up, having the processes to follow up on things, somehow culturally we are not very attuned.
It's probably not as exciting. It's not as exciting as there's no international travel these days, but yeah. And I think the other thing that's I think maybe again a subject for a future discussion. I think the other thing that we maybe in Bangladesh, and not everybody is fully aware of, again, is really what is happening in terms of global technology manufacturing trends. It's moving very fast. So, for example, I mean, it may seem a little bit of a tangent from what we're talking about, but all the while where we're sitting focusing on one thing, it's a moving game. And a good example is actually China and their AI 2025 vision. So China is moving very dynamically and moving its industries and mechanizing, automating its industries very, very rapidly with different fourth industrial revolution, AI, IoT, and big, different kinds of big data analytics. They're now trying to convert a lot of their economy into blockchain. So, of course, part of this is the US-China technology battle, which again is maybe a subject for a different discussion. But I think, on the one hand, I think that it's a very fast-moving target. So the kind of global benchmark for sophistication of technology manufacturing is moving very, very fast. So on the one hand, it's more challenging for countries like Bangladesh, but on the other hand, it is also the case that the Chinas of the world are also moving rapidly up their value chain, and they're probably keen to give up industries that they've historically had a dominant foothold in, because they're lower margin manufacturing industries. So it's I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Okay, before that, I forgot to say something about which I must mention. Another weakness in our government is the lack of coordination between agencies. Now, BIDA has been entrusted with the task of investment promotion, but a lot of the decisions which affect investors are not taken by BIDA. So, for example, the National Board of Revenue is a major player in this regard, because a lot of the uncertainty which is created happens because of tax-related decisions, whether tax policy or the actual tax-related case-by-case decisions that are taken. The Bangladesh Bank is a major player. There are other agencies which are, and coordination is one of the Achilles heels in the Bangladesh government. So foreign investment promotion is a whole of government approach. It's a very important message that I wanted to transmit today. That it's a whole of government approach, and unless all the major players in the government are singing to the same tune, is going to be very challenging to achieve our foreign investment aspirations, targets. On technology, so I'll just pick up one aspect of it. As all these new technologies come in, and the entrepreneurs in Bangladesh are entrepreneurial enough and opportunistic enough to take advantage of this. But the big bottleneck which they're going to face, and we have already had a few examples of this, is a regulatory bottleneck. Because the regulators in our country are not familiar with a lot of these technologies. So you take the case of Uber. I'm sure you're more familiar with that case than myself. When Uber first came into Bangladesh, the regulators were confused. Is it a taxi company? Is it an IT company? Or is it something else? So because the conventional definitions in our regulatory books were not adequate enough, were not modern enough to address the issues. So one of my concerns is that while on the one hand, all these waves of technology developments can bring a lot of benefits to us, and our entrepreneurs can take a very good advantage of it, unless our regulatory framework is modernized, we are going to have serious bottlenecks there. And the way to modernize the regulatory framework is not just to be very good in reacting when such technologies come in, but even better to be proactive and be anticipatory, to find out what are the likely technologies that may come to Bangladesh in the next 3, 4, 5 years. Then look at your legal framework, look at your regulatory books, and see, do we have things there which are going to create problems when these technologies come in? And let's start proactively to start revising our laws, revising our regulations before the technologies actually come. So by the time they come, we should be able to resolve them. Now, I know government has legitimate concerns. Regulation is a legitimate function of the government, and they are supposed to balance the business opportunities with the risks to society. But instead of trying to do it on the run when the technology is already here and delaying things, it will be much better if they can proactively take this. But that again requires a long-term proactive mindset, which I think is the big challenge in Bangladesh.
Well, I think on that, I think we can wrap up for today. I think we're coming up to 55 minutes an hour. I think it was a very lively discussion, and hopefully this is the first of a series of discussions we can have on Bangladesh economic policy. And I think we can bring in some other, I think, discussants and speakers, and hopefully I think we can raise some of the issues that can help work collaboratively with policymakers. I think we can conclude by saying that, as I said, Brown Bangladesh, in terms of being an economic dynamo out of COVID, or at least an economic resilience story. I think we have a great brand capital, and the key thing now is to translate that into the right kinds of economic policies to take the next step forward, so that coming out of COVID, Bangladesh is well positioned for its next phase of growth as it moves away from being an LDC and into the next phase of growth. So thank you again, Akthar Bhai, for Syed Akthar Mahmood, for joining us today, and we look forward to speaking to you again soon. And thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
And sorry, Akthar Bhai, please go ahead.
No, I'm just thanking you for inviting me. I think we had a very good chat today.
Yeah. And I wanted to thank everybody who's joined online. And I think maybe the next discussion will also leave more time for Q&A. I think we both felt so passionately about FDI and about foreign direct investment. We covered a lot of issues, and hopefully this food for thought will give people some ideas for the next session, where they can we'll have 15 minutes of Q&A as well. So thank you again. Thank you everybody for joining, and have a great day wherever you are in the world. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.